Well, hello everyone and welcome to another recorded lecture. I'm wishing you were here to discuss this topic of breaking the cycle of escalation, but I'm happy to be able to put it on video so that you have access to the information and can ask me questions via email, Zoom, or Canvas, and I'll get back to you right away. And so this discussion focuses on Chapter 5, and it's managing violent tendencies. And that really has two parts. We're going to go over the lecture about verbal abuse, okay? There's verbal abuse and then, of course, physical abuse. Today, we're going to discuss verbal abuse, and I'm going to lay out some definitions, first of all, from this chapter. Interpersonal violence. I want to draw your attention to two parts of this definition. Imposes their will, okay? And really, this is trying to overpower you. It is about power in a person trying to get their wants or needs, desires satisfied. And so there's another part of the definition, and that's verbal or physical intimidation. A lot of times, we think, when we think violence, we think that that's physical, that there's some physical violence happening. But a significant portion of this definition is the verbal abuse part of it. And that's what I really want to cover. I'm going to lay out a definition for verbal abuse, which is attacking the self-concept, the way I view myself, okay? That you're trying to diminish who I am, diminish something that's important to me, and something about me that's important to me, and really kind of diminish my self-worth. We're really looking at another one too, is it's causing psychological pain, all right? That it is, might not be your intent, but it is causing psychological pain. So that's really the two significant portions of that definition. And I really, if you have any questions, please talk to me. Sometimes students will, have experiences or give me examples and ask me if I think that's verbal definition. If it meets those two criteria I just laid out, then it is by Infante and Wigley's definition. Now, this comes from your textbook, and it really identifies characteristics that are, potentially verbally abusive, and it doesn't necessarily mean if you do this once or twice that you're necessarily verbally abusive. It really has to do with the context, right? Interruptions. You know that if you're in the middle of an argument and you are interrupting constantly, trying not to let the other person be heard, trying to communicate that they're, basically disrespected, their voice isn't, even worth hearing, that, obviously can be verbally abusive. That domineering kind of behavior. I want to draw your attention to the sounding arrogant and stereotyping. I think those can work hand in hand. I had a student who was taking exception to that. Well, if I'm arrogant, does that mean I'm verbally abusive? Not necessarily. I think it just depends on the context and how that arrogance and, like for instance, I had an example of a student who said, my partner told me that I don't know how to think for myself, that I don't really have a brain, that I'm like the sheeple he sees on TV, and essentially, just my brain doesn't work. And I just thought it was, number one, really arrogant. Number two, it really hurt. I mean, it was just, this is what someone I care about thinks about me. And I really care about my ability to think, as an individualist. And he knows that. So that was why it was so, hurtful to me. And I think that that's in conjunction. You're sounding arrogant. It can sound like contempt. Other students have really drawn the comparison to Dr. John Gottman's idea of contempt, that, that's one of the four horsemen we talked about. And contempt is really damaging. The definition is that you come from a superior place to show that you're superior to the other person by, putting them down. You can say things like, just by saying you can't think for yourself, you don't have a brain, you're not very smart. Oh, I thought you were, a bright person. and you're just like sheeple. So you sound arrogant, you're stereotyping, and you're obviously, in that specific example, hurting the person's kind of view of themselves, their self-worth, and causing psychological pain. So that's how these characteristics can be, indicative of verbal abuse. Let's move on to some correlations between verbal and physical abuse. And one of the things right away I want to draw your attention to is that that saying that sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And that was something I remember as a child that I was told by adults. But it doesn't really ring true with this research that has been done over the decades. All stages of life, from childhood to adulthood, we find that words can hurt as much or more than physical violence. And so healthcare workers in Walsh and Clark's study found that there was more stress from the verbal abuse than the physical abuse. Okay, and that was not just in healthcare workers, but later on we find that children have much more, it can be much more psychosocially damaging to experience verbal abuse as opposed to physical abuse. We also see that in a domestic cases that husbands are more verbally abusive than non-physically abusive spouses. I think that this is intuitive, but somebody did a study and determined that verbal abusiveness plays a significant role. As well as with college students going home, they were surveyed in 2009 saying that when they went home, during the semester breaks and during the summers, that parents were, not just parents, family members, that verbal abusiveness and physical aggression had a strong correlation, that verbal abusiveness generally preceded physical aggression. And the same thing in our children. We recognize that they're more likely to view violence as a natural response to being teased about physical characteristics, ethnicity, race, etc. We know adults see that as violent responses as a natural response or a justified response when, some adults see that as a justified response when these characteristics are attacked. And, that we talk about regression, we've discussed Freud and how that can be a defense mechanism and how we can regress to what we did as a child, and using our fists was, a common response. And I think that also we are talking about how children can be, the verbal abuse can be worse than the physical aggression. It can be, according to Aidan Ritter-Jones, the book that they wrote, Home is Where the Hell Is. So, these are the correlations or the strong relationships we find between verbal abuse and physical abuse. So we're talking about children. Let's look at parental verbal abuse. And this usually is a slide that is, I think, causes quite a bit of discussion because either a lot of us in the room are watching this video are parents, or we are 18, 19, 20 years old or more living with parents. And some of you can relate to this. I usually will get parents in the classroom saying, wait, if I tease my kid, even if it's joking and it's not, and it's for fun and it can be verbal abuse, and I'd say, it depends on the context, depends on what you're teasing the child about, depends how much, how frequently that interaction is happening, and if it is, damaging to the child's self-concept, and I think that teasing is something. I grew up in a family that enjoys teasing, still does. My brothers and I tease each other in a I think on a fun way, for the most part. I think that that's difficult to. It can if we go overboard and we're focusing on something sensitive that is damaging to their their self-concept and causing psychological pain, we're old enough to talk about it and say, hey, you know what, this is out of bounds. I don't appreciate it. But a lot of times kids can't do that, right? And so that's important to be aware of, the teasing part of it. I had another student who's 18, is living with his parents, and he says, you know what, I can relate to this definition because I swear, the instant I get home, I feel blamed for anything wrong in the house. I feel criticized why I'm not getting better grades, or why I'm not doing more chores, or why I'm not, dating the right people, or why I'm not living up to their expectations, right? And I feel like they just are displacing a lot of their frustration and anger onto me, right? And in that way, I feel like they just are, it does affect the way I view myself. And so I thought that was a really good example because, he feels blamed, he feels belittled, he feels insulted, and he feels, he said if he doesn't straighten up, then he's going to have to find a new place to live, and so there's threatening. So I thought that was a really good example that came out of a discussion not long ago. And so these behaviors, obviously it's contextual. If you are speaking to your kid consistently about, using some of these, methods of communication, I think that, just be aware, try to be aware and check in with the child and how the teasing or the criticizing, etc., is impacting them. I think that, is important to really do some self-assessment. So, one of these conclusions, and that's really what we're going to focus on, is that really nearly all physically violent episodes are preceded by verbal abuse. Additionally, other takeaways is that, we've talked about the correlation, and that it can be as damaging, if not more damaging, than physical abuse for children, but also for teens and adults. That's, obviously in every phase of our lives it can be more damaging. I highlighted a study with healthcare workers. Also the idea of contempt and how you can understand why a lot of marriages, contempt is the greatest, most accurate predictors of why marriages fail, is because oftentimes it's an indication of how much verbal abusiveness is happening in that household. That, if someone is coming across as superior, as arrogant, and stereotyping you, and, trying to diminish your self-worth, that's not going to be healthy for a relationship. So, wanted to start this discussion about managing violent tendencies with the all-important focus on verbal abuse. I appreciate your attention. If you have any questions, please let me know, and have a good day.